is it fair to say that your initial impressions of him was that he was intelligent and charming?
Oh, yeah, well, he was intelligent. I wouldn't call it charming. I thought he might have used the phrase that I thought he was shy. He didn't engage in conversations or initiate conversations, so I thought he was just shy.
Do you recall previously stating that your sister was attracted to his dry sense of humor?
Yes, I think that would be a first statement.
And did you also notice that he had a dry sense of humor?
Yeah, it was kind of, if someone had tripped, he would laugh at it. That kind of sense of humor, if you want to call that dry.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. This episode deals with day 6 in the ongoing Durst trial. I've got a funny feeling that there's not going to be a day 7, or after day 7 there's going to be a long adjournment, possibly for 30 days, possibly for 3 months or more, because of the coronavirus. Although there are many permutations and manifestations of what the coronavirus is doing around the world, cancelling lots of sports events and so on, it is also having its impact on justice. And the headline one of the headlines in the Los Angeles Times on March the 13th dealt with scared jurors, delayed trials and court closures. In Matt Hamilton's article, he talks about the busiest trial court in America is the trial court in Los Angeles, which is where Robert Durst is being tried. The article already points out that jurors over the age of 60 are being excused. One can easily imagine Robert Durst's defense saying, as an elderly defendant, a guy who's about to turn 77 years old, he risks catching the virus himself and so needs to be in protective custody of some sort, or certainly protected from the pandemic. And that alone is cause for adjourning this case, I won't say indefinitely, but certainly for at least a month and more than likely longer. So if there's going to be frustration about the Robert Durst case being put on hold, bear in mind that it's not just that case, it's the entire LA County Superior Court. Hamilton refers to 36 courthouses, thousands of pending cases, and a regular spate, as he puts it, of high-profile trials that are all going to be postponed simultaneously. So I'll put a link to that article in the description, but for the rest of this episode we're going to look at day 6 in the Durst trial. For me it was possibly the most interesting day of all, besides certain elements of the prosecution's opening statement. Now, one of the things to bear in mind with the Durst case, especially when we're talking about what happened right in the beginning in January 1982, when Robert Durst's wife, Kathie, suddenly disappeared, is you have a very strange scenario that is potentially playing out. And the scenario is Kathie had 4 siblings. I think she was the youngest. And so she disappears and the 4 siblings are sort of wondering what's going on and quite activated and agitated. And they already know that Robert Durst has sort of been acting strangely, acting aggressively, acting abusively, and all of that kind of thing. But they are quite I won't say an impoverished family, but they are certainly nowhere near as well off as the Dursts, and they know that. And the Dursts also know that. And so what is really interesting, in one of the depictions, I'm not sure if it's the Lost Wife of Robert Durst, the movie that showed on Lifetime. But in that particular movie, when the character goes into the police station, he's got a copy of, it might be Time magazine or something, and it talks about the men who own New York, and that's kind of how he identifies himself to the police officer or the detective in charge, which is kind of a play on in power. And within about 2 months, the cops were no longer really investigating the case and telling the McCormick family, Kathie McCormick's family, that it was a cold case, that it was kind of over. And James McCormack testified that he blew up at this news, that he was completely shocked by it. But the part that I kind of want to emphasize is Kathie Durst didn't disappear in a vacuum. She had 4 siblings who knew her and loved her and kind of wondered what had happened. And they were familiar with the dynamics that were going on at the time. They were aware that she was quite close to graduating as a doctor, as a pediatrician, and they were aware that she wanted to divorce her husband, and they were also aware that she was trying to leverage circumstances so that she could come out of the divorce with a reasonable settlement. She wasn't looking for millions or billions. She was looking for, I think, $250,000. But she was going a little bit of a precarious route. She'd gotten a certain amount of dirt on the family in terms of documents and that sort of thing. So I won't say she was trying to blackmail the family, but she was certainly trying to put herself in a position where things could get complicated if Durst kind of put his foot down and didn't give his wife anything in a divorce settlement. And this certainly plays into, well, we'll get to that in a moment. The other side is Robert Durst also has siblings. He's got a younger brother, Douglas. He's got another younger brother, Thomas. And he's got a younger sister, Wendy. And you sort of got to wonder, with the publicity, the negative publicity of Robert's wife disappearing, in inverted commas, how would his siblings react? How would they see their situations in terms of their family, themselves, their wealth, their money, their prestige, their reputations, and versus Roger, right? So look at it from that perspective. And then over time, whatever their feelings in terms of their older brother, with their sense of wanting to back him up or defend him or whatever way you want to put it, would that possibly change if there was the possibility of a rising body count? I'm just speculating and I'm just putting a couple of thoughts out there. But what I'm trying to get you to get your mind to that point of is you've got 2 sets of siblings. And obviously the one set of siblings is, they're family members of Kathie's. And they're obviously in her corner. She's done nothing to them, and they love her and they care about her and they want to know what's happened to her. And they want to find out what has happened, right? So that is not a conspiracy. That is just a normal response of a caring family to what has happened to their sister. And they ultimately were defeated in that until now. There's never really been a satisfactory answer to what happened to their sister. Her body was never found. Because the police stopped investigating, they started doing a kind of surreptitious amateur sleuthing where they would go to that cottage, the lakeside cottage, at night and see if they could find something. And one aspect that is fascinating is Robert Durst actually called up, I think it was James McCormack or Jim, and told him, can you come and fetch Kathie's stuff? Kathie's left, she may have left with a drug dealer or whatever. That was his story. And can you come and get her stuff? And when James got there was like nothing there. There was no clothing. There was virtually nothing. And the only thing of Kathie's that I think he was able to find and claim was, I think, a fishing pole. And you might say, wow, that's pretty strange. I wonder what that's all about. But another way of looking at that is that Durst was trying to communicate that she left on her own. But think about it like this. If Durst himself had thrown away all of Kathie's stuff, and now he's saying, well, can you come and get Kathie's stuff? He had to have known that her stuff's not there. But can you imagine it from the siblings' perspective? It's almost like, you said I must come and get Kathie's stuff. There's nothing to take. What is going on? And what I think is being potentially communicated there is, well, she must have taken all her stuff. Can you see that? Can you see that she has? And you can kind of imagine Robert Durst pleading ignorance, saying, well, I didn't know that all her stuff's gone. I mean, I just called you because I assumed her stuff's lying around. But no one would do that. And this is a very interesting, if somewhat subtle point, when we bear in mind what happened with Morris Black. That's something that he's admitted, I think, it's either in the Jinx or in one of his interviews, but he basically said, after killing and dismembering Morris Black, Durst went back into his apartment, Morris Black's apartment, and made it look like Morris Black wasn't coming home. I seem to remember something like that. And if that is true, then you kind of have a potential parallel between the two cases. I mean, we don't know for a fact that Durst was involved in Kathie's disappearance, but the part that seems to correlate is this thing of taking someone's stuff behind their back and making it look like they intended to leave. And because they've intended to leave, I had no idea. Now, if you take this concept and you apply it to the Chris Watts case and also to the Patrick Frazee case, if more of the possessions that had belonged to these people had been removed from the scene, there would have been kind of a potential scenario where you might have thought, well, maybe they did leave. Maybe they have gone somewhere with someone. Who knows? Of course, in the era of social media, that becomes less and less believable when someone just goes radio silent or social media silent. I'm just saying, if in terms of the fiddling with the crime scene, which happened, I think, in the Morris Black case, if the same thing happened in the Kathie Durst situation, it does lend some credence to this idea that, well, maybe someone took their stuff and left and moved out and didn't say anything. In Shanann Watts' case, if her phone and handbag and medicine had disappeared from the crime scene, it probably would have taken some weeks to decide for certain that there was foul play, if that makes sense. Before I play the next clip, I just want to address the point made in the original clip, or the first clip, where James McCormack says that when he talks about Robert Durst's sense of humor, he talks about a man who, when somebody falls, he finds it funny. Now, the word to describe that kind of sense of humor, you can either call it dry or dark, but as far as I'm concerned, that is a sadistic sense of humor. It is someone who takes pleasure in the suffering of somebody else. And that is certainly something that seems to, if you think of Robert Durst and you look at the way that he's behaved in the past, urinating and belching and so on, he seems to be doing a lot of things that he feels good about, but are at the expense of everybody around him. Something like shoplifting is something that seems like a very almost harmless way of doing something like that, except if you've got a lot of money. Dismembering somebody seems hard to do if you don't have a sadistic bone in your body. Wouldn't you say that? And although it may seem like it is not really related to anything, when you talk about some of the semantics that are involved here, so when Robert Durst was overheard saying something to the effect of that he wants to ego Douglas, that's not a verbatim quote, but he certainly used those two words side by side, Igor Douglas. That kind of sounds like a sadistic way to refer to whatever he was saying. Wouldn't you agree? Okay, and so let's go on to the next clip.
The relationship, seemed to get strained in, I guess, mid 70s, 75, 76 time frame, in that area. I didn't know why, but they just seemed to be tense. And I've since come to know about the situation that Bob forced on Kathie, which was,
Let me stop you for a moment. Was Kathie a family-oriented person?
oh, absolutely.
And did you become aware at some point that Kathie had wanted to have children?
Yes, that was the family culture that she was raised in.
And you come from a family of 5, is that right?
That's correct.
And all of your siblings have children, is that correct?
Yes.
I want to show you what I'm going to mark as people's 23.
Yes.
Do you recognize this photograph?
Yeah, that's Kathie right dead center. Christopher's right to her, sitting on her lap.
You don't have to name everybody in the
Okay.
picture, but you're saying Kathie's in the middle, is that right?
Kathie's in the middle, and that's me on the upper left as you're looking at it. 2 Kathy's right.
And is this fair to say this is McCormick family and children and grandchildren?
Having a good time. Grandma's my mom is on the floor, stretched out. I mean,
Any idea approximately when this picture would have been taken?
this would have been taken probably early 70s, like 74-ish, 75.
Did Kathie ever express to you a desire herself to have children?
Not overtly, but I know she had that desire. I mean, it was just the family culture that she was from.
You had, strike that. You indicated that you became aware of a situation with Mr. Durst and Kathie in the mid-70s that you said changed the relationship. Can you describe how the relationship changed?
Kathie, the situation, can I describe it?
Sure.
Kathie was forced to have a divorce. An abortion. Kathie was forced to have an abortion under threat of a divorce. And when that happened, Kathie really just refocused her energies not to maintain the love that she once had for Bob, or to restore it, but to focus it on herself, and not to be selfish that way, but just to take the gifts that she had, the intelligence, the passion to learn, the desire to be there for other people, especially in the healthcare industry. So she completed her pre-med nursing degree at Western Connecticut, and then she segued that to wanting to become a doctor, so she got admitted to Albert Einstein College of Medicine.
And Kathie graduated in 1978, correct?
She graduated from the at Western Connecticut. She had the nursing degree pre-med, prerequisite.
And then she started medical school,
Yes.
and that's in the Bronx, is that correct?
Yeah, it's in the Bronx. I don't know where in the Bronx, but it's in the Bronx.
Can you tell me, in terms of the way that you would see yourself, Mr. Durst treating your sister after the relationship changed, can you describe what you would see? And I'm going to get to the incident, the holiday incident later, but I just want to ask you, just in general.
Bob would be more curt, dismissive of her points of view. He certainly wasn't showing any sense of humor by that time. And Kathie was, kind of stubborn and tolerated that abuse.
Would Kathie still come over and interact with your family?
Kathie would visit the family thereafter, pretty much one-on-one with the family, my sisters. Bob didn't come too often, except for the holiday, the holidays that were kind of like the family gathering. Typically at my mom's, because my mom never had a driver's license.
And can you describe, was there an incident that occurred at one of these holiday gatherings?
Yes.
Can you please describe, to the best of your memory, what happened?
Yeah, there was a Christmas gathering at my mom's house. We had our sit-down dinner, and then the sit-down dinner led to an after-dinner cocktail. We were in my mom's living room, and I was on this end of the couch, and Kathie was on this end of the couch.
Indicating opposite ends of the couch for the record.
Opposite ends of the couch, as close as I am to this gentleman. And opposite me was my grandma. She was Grandma Soft. She was going to be 90 that year. And Bob had, started the process of going home, but he had to warm up the diesel. It was a 210 diesel, which is a diesel that, you had to put half a gallon of gasoline into the diesel fuel just to keep it from freezing in the wintertime. So he went out to warm up the car, and he was kind of like impatient. And Kathie was sitting there with a glass of red wine. I had a bottle of beer. And unfortunately, I probably will be thinking of this till the day I die. But the next thing I know, Bob insisted that she get up. And Kathie wanted to continue a conversation because the glass wasn't empty with myself and my grandma. And, he got impatient. He went out, and then he came back in very quickly, walked over as quickly as like, a very quick step, grabbed Kathie by the top of her head like that, and yanked her, and she went with the yank.
Let me stop you,
Yes.
Mr. McCormick. You've seen the movie All Good Things, is that correct?
I've seen it at least once, yeah.
And the scene of that incident is depicted in the movie, is that correct?
Yeah, it's a representation of the incident, yeah.
And in general terms, obviously, those are actors and actresses.
Yes.
Does that image, does that depiction, does that accurately, to the best of your memory, depict what happened?
It's close, yeah. I mean, what I'm depicting right now is what happened. I was there.
Did either you or your brother-in-law or any of the men who were in the house, did anybody do anything to try to stop what was happening?
No, the way it happened, it was so spontaneous and unexpected. I mean, you really go into a temporary state of shock, like, it's like a lightning bolt. And the next thing you know, Kathie got up and was going with Bob, and they went literally to the door when I'm still sitting there, like, in shock, literal shock. And Kathie's coat was on the bench by the door. It's where Mom used to keep where you store your coats when you come to visit. She grabbed the coat and she turned and she said something to the effect, "It's all right, Jim." And then she went out the door, and that was the end of that.
So there are at least two dramatic depictions of this seminal scene where you basically have the whole family, the McCormack family, celebrating Christmas at home, and obviously they are Christians celebrating Christmas, and Durst is Jewish, so that's not really something he's interested in, and maybe as a result of that he wants to leave early. Now, interestingly, in the two depictions, I find the All Good Things version far inferior to the Lifetime movie. For starters, the All Good Things depiction is very short, and there's no sort of moment where the actress pauses at the door and says, "It's okay, Jim." So that part isn't even in there. So I prefer the Lifetime movie, which sort of shows the whole scene in a slightly longer version, and it also sketches out, I don't know whether this is based on the truth, but it certainly feels as though it resonates with the character of Bob Durst, which is he's sort of standing on his own, he's smoking, while the McCormack family are sort of chatting and sort of warmly gathered in the lounge. He inhales, his cigarette, and then he stubs out his cigarette in one of the Christmas pies, and from there he decides to leave, and then he sort of enters the house again. And this is the part that I don't really understand the fact that the prosecutor didn't really emphasize this, is that from what I know, from what I understand, Durst sort of entered the room quite abruptly, grabbed his wife by the hair, not by her head, but by her hair, and sort of dragged her out of the partway out of the room by her hair. But then I do get a sense that he let her go and stormed out, and then Kathie was sort of standing halfway to the door, sort of recovering, hunched over and recovering, kind of held out her hand and kind of said, "It's okay, Jim," and then sort of in a moment of, just shock and embarrassment and shame and pain, sort of stumbled out, took her coat off the hook and off the rack and left the house. But that moment kind of sets the tone for a situation where Bob Durst could do something and no one would do anything. No one would respond. They'd be so shocked that he would sort of be granted a kind of leeway, like a kind of license to do something completely unacceptable, and everyone would go along with it, including his own wife. And you've got to ask yourself, given that Bob Durst is quite a small guy, why was it that he was allowed to get away with this? Anyway, on to the next clip. So we've got this sort of strange evolution with the McCormick family, who I think are somewhat in awe of the Durst legend and the Durst influence and the Durst sort of power and prestige, I guess, in New York compared to their own. But this kind of awe is slowly sort of whittled away by the inappropriate behavior, the rudeness, the bad manners, and then eventually just the overall sort of despicableness of the this character that has come into their sister's life. And there's this slow change where in the beginning it is all fairy tales and ponies and rainbows, but after the abortion things go rapidly downhill, and a lot of things are going on. There are affairs, there are drugs, there are there's the world that is pulling Robert Durst one way in terms of the family business, and then there's Kathie, who's studying medicine, and it's sort of slowly pulling them into sort of different worlds. So what is interesting is, if you study the media narrative, then it was sort of part of the defense case and sort of part of what was said either by Robert Durst or by people who knew him, that, well, Kathie was a drug addict, she was very much into cocaine. We know that they often went to Studio 54, which is a famous cocaine den, but they were sort of saying that, well, it was really Kathie that was on drugs and that she had run off with a drug dealer, and so it's completely inexplicable and off she's gone kind of thing. The other aspect that I found fascinating in terms of trial day 6 was both the admission that Kathie was actually afraid of Seymour Durst. So she was afraid of Bob, but she was also afraid of his father. And in one of the depictions, I believe it was from All Good Things, the character playing Seymour Durst says something like, "She's not one of us," which speaks to this idea that there's both a class difference in terms of, Kathie wasn't from the same privileged background as the Dursts, but possibly also speaking of a kind of a cultural discrimination. She's not Jewish, she's not one of us, so you kind of get the sense that possibly the Durst dynasty as a whole, the Durst family as a whole, kind of didn't like Kathie or didn't mind the idea of her disappearing from the scene, and maybe Robert knew that. I'm speculating, of course. I'm just saying, in a scenario where and this may be totally different from the McCormick side of the family. I don't think that the McCormick side of the family necessarily would have looked at the Dursts in the way that they may have looked at them. I don't know this for a fact. I'm just saying you have a situation where it's a Jewish family and a Christian family, and obviously a lot of it depends, of course, if you're a practicing and somewhat fundamentalist Jewish community, but just based on kind of the stereotype, and it's difficult to be absolutely clear, but there are a lot of Jewish families that want to only marry within the Jewish community. And so if the Durst were that kind of family, and they did seem to be quite a unique kind of family, if that's the way to put it, then possibly that is how they viewed Kathie, kind of as an outsider. And if Robert knew this, then would they really mind if she was sort of out of the way? We can compare it to some extent with the Chris Watts case, where you kind of had a situation where Shanann was not very popular with Chris Watts' own parents at the time that she, in inverted commas, disappeared, right? And so given that was the case, would Chris Watts really need to explain to his parents what had happened to his wife and even to his children? They would kind of say, well, we didn't really like her. She'd sort of cut us out of her life anyway, and the children, so it all kind of makes sense. But can you see it from the perspective of the potential perpetrator, how these dynamics might play into it? So I wanted to address all of the things in one episode. I'm not going to do that. I will go to the testimony from the siblings and I think a colleague. I'm not 100% sure if it's not two siblings, but certainly one sibling, Virginia, and then someone else called Mary. We'll deal with in the next episode, part 2 to this analysis of day 6. Before I sign off, just something else I want to mention is that the New York Post, their news coverage highlighted the fact that the defense suggested that possibly Seymour had something to do with Kathie's disappearance, which is pretty crazy. I mean, you would almost imagine, did the defense come up with this? Is it plausible? Bear in mind, in the Casey Anthony case, you also had this sort of theoretical involvement, in inverted commas, of George Anthony in what happened to Kaylee. So now you kind of have the same thing, except Seymour Durst isn't really around, and you sort of wonder, what does Robert Durst think about this defense? Does he like it? Is it convenient? Is it true? What do you think? So I'll be back on Monday or Sunday for part 2, just dealing with the other dimension to the testimony on day 6. I will also put up the letter Vincent van Gogh wrote to his brother on the 15th of March 1890, so 130 years ago to the day, and I'll probably do that tomorrow and then do part 2 to this particular episode on Monday. As I say, I have a funny feeling that the Durst trial is going to be postponed at least for a month and possibly for 3 months or even more. So there may not be much more to talk about until the trial resumes, but let's take that one day at a time. Thank you for listening. On the Patreon channel, I've just uploaded an episode on self-esteem, which is the key to understanding Chris Watts. If you're interested in that, I will put a link in the description. So stay safe, wash those hands, keep up the social distancing, control your anxiety, and look out for one another, and I will see you guys next time.
Certainly anger at Kathie not jumping when he said jump.
Can you describe when Bob Durst would interact with your family? Can you describe what that was like?
I would call it rude.
Specific place rather than broad general. Over broad.
I would describe Bob's decorum, before my mom especially, and my sisters and I, as bordering on rude.
Can you explain what you mean by that, please?
He'd come into the, say at the dining room table, and he'd just belch as though, that was the normal thing to do, and we weren't raised that way, so I would call that rude.
Did he ever attempt to say, excuse me, or to acknowledge the inappropriateness?
No, and I still remember at least one time, probably many times, Kathie would actually make the excuse for him.
And as you were watching Mr. McCormick, did this appear to be something involuntary, or did this appear to be, from what you were watching over the times you saw it, something intentional?
I would say it was pretty much intentional. I mean, let's face it, if we all have to belch, we kind of restrain ourselves.
Were you aware in terms of how Mr. Durst was with money, based on your experience?
Well, going back to when I first met him at the West Side, or the East Side Tavern, I bought the first round. I bought the second round. I believe Tommy bought the third round, and Bob never bought a round.
And I'm going to assume that you and your brother-in-law Tom did not have the financial resources that Mr. Durst did at that time?
No, Tommy was, I guess, a probationary fireman or a rookie in the New York City Fire Department, and I, at that time, did not have a substantial job.
Did you ever try to engage Mr. Durst in conversation about his work or about finances?
Well, I wanted to get ahead in my business career. I hooked up with a company called International Harvester, and I wanted to learn because you learn from people who have been there in our school. And I was told at one time that Bob had a degree from UCLA in a higher degree in economics, because that was my field when I was at St. John's University. And up at the Katona House, I had started a conversation, and it went nowhere. Almost as though, deflect, because he didn't have a degree, as I came to know later on.
If anything happens to me, don't let them get away with it.